some point or another. I am Christy Barnwell in the History Department. And this talk today is going to be specifically about the security wall, or the wall. We'll talk about actually all of the names that go along with that, and the semantic kind of meanings and symbolism behind what it gets called, depending on who's talking about it and what that implies. And so what we're going to do today is start off with just an overview of sort of, I'm a historian and I mostly play with documents, right? But what's interesting about the wall itself is that it is an object. It is part of like material culture. And so there's a lot of different ways of thinking about the wall as a form of, we can think about it as a text. We can think about it as sort of an idea. We can think about it as a barrier. We can think about it as like this object made of various things and what it does and so on. And in the idea of history and thinking about material culture, we think about the kind of meanings that are connected to the actions of the wall, or like the agency that people exercise around the wall. The wall itself is a site of agency. And so we'll get into these kinds of questions, not necessarily as a text in the traditional historical sense, but as an object that people interact with in various ways, as well as sort of its meaning in the larger context of the Palestinian resistance and liberation and Israeli occupation. We're going to look at it from all of these kinds of ways. So what we're going to start with is this idea of what is the wall? What is it made of? What is it? How big is it? Where is it? What does it do? How's it supposed to? So we'll start with what is the wall. We'll then talk about how the wall has names, how those names are used to denote different specific messages, and what those messages then mean for the people who interact with the wall. And we're going to talk about where the wall is. And then we're going to talk about what does the wall actually do in physical terms, metaphorical terms, symbolic terms, in all these kinds of ways. Courtney, I did not get around to like actually making you a little thing because I'm messy today. So we're going to start off with this idea of what is the wall. And so the wall was born as an idea at some level in 1992. The Israeli prime minister at the time, Yitzhak Rabin, had this idea in 1992 that wouldn't it be nice if there was a wall that kind of separated out these two places from one another. And in sort of a period of violence, and or an uptick in violence, there was this idea that a wall or a segment of the wall or some kind of barrier was built in 1994. So in 92, there were these vague ideas of the conception of this wall. In 94, there was a segment that went up in one particular space. And then Yitzhak Rabin sort of moved on to other things before he then died. And it was later on that, and in the Intifada, the second Intifada, Intifada means uprising. Actually, it means like shaking off. And so there was an uprising at the end of the 80s, a rising up and shaking off. And then there was a second intifada that took place in the late 90s, early 2000s, another sort of popular uprising. And in that time period, in 2000, the Israeli government decided to develop a plan for a wall, a barrier, this thing that would divide up the West Bank from the rest of the territory, and sort of carve off and place the West Bank behind this barrier. And so the plan was developed in 2000, and it started being funded around 2000. And then in 2002 was the first segment of what we actually think of as this wall, as part of this plan that was built. The first segment was built in 2002, and every year from that point forward, there has been continuous expansion of an enhancement of this barrier. And so it continues. It is not complete, but it continues. The wall is a multi-layered barrier in various places, multi-layered, consisting of fencing, technology, concertina wire, gates, guard towers, and the iconic concrete slabs. So let's look at these slabs here going up on the screen. And for those who are in the chat, Courtney, if you wouldn't mind recopying that box link. So some of the images are probably hard for some of you to see. You can open the box link and actually get a better image, which I hear is really helpful when we're looking at maps, so that you can kind of see that. But for this group, you can see the wall. It's not terribly thick, but it is extremely high. The concrete slabs are around 30 feet tall, though you can see that 10 feet or so go down into the ground. They go far into the ground, and up above, they are often around close to 30 feet or like 8 meters above the ground. And then on top of that, you can see here layers of concertina or razor wire that are sort of around the top of the wall. If we go to another slide, the next slide, you can get a better image of the kinds of wire. In other places, it's not a wall in the sense that we think about it. It is a fence, or it is a series of layers of fence. So here you can see pyramids of razor wire or concertina wire around what is a thinner or weaker kind of fence. And then in between it, there will be another fence beyond that. And then on the other side of it, another layer of this pyramid of concertina wire. The next slide. It consists of guard towers from which Israeli forces can oversee, look at, monitor, and use guns to sort of provide quote unquote security for the Israeli side of the wall, right? There are also, if we go to the next one, these fenced areas, you can kind of see another thing that happens. So around a lot of these fenced areas, there are these buffers that include these wide swaths of territory, not just where the fence is, but then on either side of it, there are these kind of no man's land sorts of areas where no one should be walking, no one should have access unless it's Israeli forces. And these are usually about 200 to 300 foot wide areas. And on either side of these fences, there will be at some distance those pyramids of wire. This longer, strong fence topped with electronic detection equipment is often attached. There are also ditches that are sort of anti-vehicle ditches that are meant so that you can't get your car past the ditch, right? It's meant to stop cars no matter what. There is, so sort of, let me point out that there is, according to Israeli sources, there was like a minister from the Israeli forces who described it as a multi-layered composite obstacle comprised of several elements: a ditch and a pyramid-shaped stack of 6 coils of barbed wire on either side of the structure, barbed wire on one side of the structure, that is the western side, the West Bank side, a path enabling the patrol of Israeli forces on both sides of the structure, then an intrusion and detection fence in the center of this swath of area, sensors to warn of any incursion, smooth strips of sand running parallel to the fence so that they can detect footprints. So the level of kind of militarized security observation, I don't know, booby traps. I don't know how else to describe it. This large, wide area of space that is broad as much as it is high in various places uses all of these layers of security to prevent movement towards across the wall, to end movement across these 2 places. Upon completion, the wall is expected to be 440 miles in length. The wall has many names. Let's go to the next slide. And you'll see a little bit of that here. The wall has many names. And for all of us here in the audience and for there, let's remember that these naming practices are meant to seem sometimes innocuous or to convey very specific meanings. And they provide us with really important information. So sometimes it seems like a little bit of a silly detail. It's clearly a wall. Let's talk about it as a wall. It's clearly a security barrier. Let's talk about it. These things each have their own sets of meanings attached to them. So Israel calls this a security wall or a fence when it's referenced in Hebrew, or a separation wall or fence. When they reference it in English news outlets, it's often referred to specifically as a security fence, de-emphasizing the wall, emphasizing that it's a fence, making it seem less offensive to the audience, less scary, but emphasizing this idea of security as the essential purpose, that Israel is threatened, and so must have this security in place. And this idea is emphasized, like lots of scholars have talked about this mindset of defensiveness in terms of the ways in which Israel builds its military sort of forces around it. Avi Shlaim, the author of The Iron Wall, discusses not this wall as much as it is the mindset behind the wall, the idea of militarization and fear-based language that's used in Israeli society, in Israeli discourse, as a way to enforce and reinforce victim status when justifying within Israeli Zionist society and to the Western world the continuous expense on military and the militarization of Israeli society. So it becomes part of this language about security, the constant need, reiteration of this idea of security, just in the name of it. Palestinians call it the separation wall, or the apartheid wall, or the wall of like racial separation. And this language emphasizes the racial and social injustice of the wall in the minds and experience of Palestinians. It references the systematized separation and disenfranchisement of Palestinians under Israeli occupation. And in using that language of apartheid, it connects the Palestinian experience to other global forms of racism and global struggles for freedom and liberation. Now, news sources then use this language, news sources and other agencies use yet a different, more softened language to describe the wall in an effort to sound more neutral. So they call it the barrier. They call it the separation barrier. They call it the West Bank barrier. They call the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, references it as the wall. And the kind of neutralized language serves to provide news sources and other international organizations with the cover of being or seeming objective or neutral, right, as not taking sides. So specific, all of these kinds of things become sort of ingrained so that you use it regularly and it reinforces the message that you want it to reinforce over and over again, just in the naming of the wall. I'm going to talk a little bit more about security later on because we're going to ask, does the system even work? Does it actually make Israel safer? And there's a lot of questions about that. But in the meantime, we're going to talk about first, where is the wall? And this is a really significant question. If you attended or listened to any of the earlier pieces where we talked about the 1967 war and the UN resolution, and the way in which Palestine was sort of partitioned off in various iterations, you'll understand that there were boundaries that were established in 1949 and then in 1967 that were internationally recognized. So in 48, the war, Israel's war for independence, Palestine's Nakba, the catastrophe, began. But the conflict, the war itself continued until 1949 when there was an armistice. And the armistice line is on this map, this red line that recognizes the partition of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip from what becomes Israel, right? And then in 1967, these two territories, which had been sort of administered by Jordan and Egypt until 1967, and the consequence of that war, Israel occupies this territory of the West Bank, of the Gaza Strip, and additionally the Gaza or the Golan Heights in the north in Syria. And UN Resolution 242 says that the occupation at some point should end for a peaceful resolution, that Palestine or that Israel should withdraw the occupation to that 1949 armistice line. that this occupation then falls under these red lines that you can see here, and that those red lines mark like the basis for the framework of a future Palestinian state, which from 1967 onward sort of serves as the basis for land switching back and forth and what's going to happen, right? So in terms of international frameworks, the West Bank and Gaza Strip are the future sites of some Palestinian something, right? In theory. Now, the wall itself then actually does not follow this armistice line. The black lines here kind of indicate the ways in which the line is proposed or where it actually is created. So solid is where it's actually created. Dotted lines are where it's proposed to go. And it's this squiggly line that operates within the West Bank, inside of that armistice line, not on the armistice line. The claims are from the Israeli side, well, this is just where we have to put it on the basis of what's dangerous, on the basis of like physical things that we have to operate and move around. But there's a lot of international concern and question about that, the legitimacy of that claim. And in fact, almost immediately upon the wall being created in 2000, within a year, the ICJ ruled this wall and this plan as violating international law, and several UN organizations regularly monitor the wall and its movement and its impact on Palestinians as part of a humanitarian crisis and as a violation of humanitarian rights and international law. So the wall flouts this green line and flouts these 1967-49 kind of boundaries, all right? So then this map over here is the most up-to-date, right? Every year you can find tons of infographics on the wall, but the wall has to be constantly monitored. And so this graphic over here actually comes from the UN Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. And this was the latest information I could get from August 2023, which kind of illustrates some of the ways in which not only there is this green line, the wall itself, but other ways in which there are places, barriers, obstacles for movement. So let's click to the next slide. So what does the wall do? That's really kind of the question that gives it meaning and helps us understand what its purpose is and how it actually functions, right? As an object and as a purveyor of meaning. So one of the things that it does is it serves, if we the next one, as a site of oppression. It removes land from Palestinians. Around 10% of the land that from the armistice line is actually on the other side, the eastern side of the wall, and is separated from the rest of the West Bank. So 10% of the land is being eroded from Palestinian control on the West Bank by the creation of this wall. It annexes, it allows Israel to annex territory into Israeli control, right? And part of this is because as you see this wall moving around over here, we can see it over here, it encapsulates or creates these little enclaves in which it absorbs various settlements that have been established on this side of the wall. So the wall wriggles and moves around in these weird ways that go deep inside the territory, which either protects settlements that were there when Israel started building the wall, or creates new opportunities for settlers to move in and claim that land on this side of the wall. So that's one thing, another piece that it does. It creates these enclaves that get annexed by Israel as these fait accomplis and an extended area of power. It also, if you see here in Jerusalem, now Jerusalem has been divided into East and West with the idea that Israel will use the West side is the Israeli side, and the East, or sorry, Israel gets the East side and Palestinians get the West side. But the wall for Jerusalem goes all the way around here, which allows Israel to lay stronger claims to a future claim of Jerusalem. And that is a key issue within the framework for any kind of peace agreement, particularly going all the way back to like 47. The idea under the mandate was, would Jerusalem become like this neutral place where everybody and some international force was in charge of it? But now this wall allows Israel space to sort of move in and claim it and separates it from the West Bank. Under the previous American administration, the United States government recognized Israel's claim to all of Jerusalem as its capital, whereas that actually flouted a lot of both American and international sort of trends in sort of recognizing Jerusalem as a unique place that had to be divided, or had both sides had some claim to it, or an international community should have claim to it. The creation of the wall throughout this process also creates destruction of farmland, houses, and trees, and cuts off Palestinians from access to their farm and their lands and their livelihoods, their jobs that they might get to, right? So the ability to cross into Jerusalem where jobs might be, or in the countryside, a lot of this farmland is then, trees are uprooted to place areas for this wall, or to expand the fence out, or this broad fence path that takes away land. And there are images that you can find on the internet all over the place. There's all kinds of imagery that sort of illustrates some of the harmful impacts of this. But like where you can see people not able, like the wall runs right through their land and they don't have access to the other side of the farm, the orchard, where they may have been farming for generations. And so again, one of the reasons the ICJ and the UN continuously refer to this is that as the wall expands, it creates more and more of these divisions and of people and their access to the land. It's also psychologically humiliating. So throughout this process, what this allows for, or creates on this map, the UN sort of tracks all of these obstacles and checkpoints. And so here you can see that all along here, there are these places where red sites that are like permanent checkpoints. There is a film, it's a sort of a fictional film, but it displays this really effectively, called Amrika. And it opens with a Palestinian woman and her son. She's trying to get through the checkpoints. I think she needed to go to the hospital to get her job, all of these kinds of things. And it was such, you see in this moment, in this scene, in the opening parts of the film, sort of her emotional, physical crisis that she experiences going through this process of trying to deal with the Israeli forces that are preventing her from moving in and out. And there are lots of stories. There's enormous numbers of stories of people sort of talking about their experience, trying to get through the wall, trying to get through these checkpoints, and the way that they are shut off from their families. If the wall closes and you're in Jerusalem doing a job, you can't get back to your family. You don't know when you're going to get back to. If you've got to get into school, to university, and the checkpoints close, you don't have access to those anymore. And so the way that on a daily basis, it disrupts people's lives and subjects them to sort of this lineup. Do you have a permit? These moments of daily contact. There's lots of scholarship on the way in which this sort of has a psychological and emotional toll. Okay. It's also a really important site of resistance. So we'll click again. And one of the things that this map is really good for sort of illustrating up close exactly where this wall is in comparison to West Jerusalem and the Old City and who has access to it. So you can see that it's far into this territory and sort of creates this barrier that prevents people. And if you kind of look in here, you can see here the way the wall meanders around in this side of West Jerusalem, and then, or East Jerusalem, and then meanders around these really large Israeli settlements that Israel then uses to this wall to sort of absorb. So now we can go on to the wall as a site of resistance. So you could Google, do a Google image search and find a million pictures of the artwork on the wall. And it's become a site of serious and day-to-day kind of instances of this. So all of these images are actually from the UN's digital exhibit, The Writing is on the Wall, Annexation Past and Present. And if you wouldn't mind moving that opening and sort of doing this share or something, I'm not sure where we put that, but leave that to for you to figure out. If any of you in the audience click on it, it'll take you to these boxes of sites, like of quotes and facts about the wall. So I think if you just move it to yes, and then expand it. Boxes of sites and pictures and so on, and who wrote them, and these quotations. And if we scroll through there, you see all kinds of imagery. This one is one that had really broken, if you scroll down just a little bit, this one here had like really broken my heart at one point. So this image is an image that is meant to represent Palestinians. And so this young child sort of in that represents Palestinians in the lap of Lady Liberty, sort of crying, is one that often evokes something for me. There's an image here of a child's playground up against, like within close proximity to the wall, and you can see the guard tower in the back. And sort of the psychological trauma of being a child in the shadow of this wall, where you know that there are forces sort of looking at you, is just unimaginable to me some days. If we scroll, let's see, scroll to the George Floyd and Floyd. There we go, that one there, where it says, I can't breathe, I want justice. So I've done various exercises in one of my classes where I asked students to pick an image and then describe it and talk about it and sort of try to interpret it. And that was one that really sort of like shocked students for a moment. But what it is sort of a reflection of the way in which, I don't know if people remember this, some of us remember this from sort of the uprising after George Floyd's death. In the marches and in the protests and so on, there was a lot of online activism discussing between Palestinians and activists in the Black Lives Matter movement and so on, sort of sharing information about how to resist tear gas, how to practice nonviolent civil disobedience, and all of these kinds of things. What do you do when a military comes and sort of interrupts your protest? And this kind of imagery often shows up in reference to this sense that there is this broader solidarity movement, this idea of apartheid and racial segregation that exists in the United States, that existed in South Africa, that exists in Palestine, and sort of drawing connections between this level of colonial injustice and resistance to colonial injustice. So the other site that I had over there is another sort of photo that's called Active Stills. And this one I kind of came across doing research for this, and it is a Palestinian and an Israeli who is himself an anti-Zionist, and they established this social justice cooperative where they take photos of aspects of the wall. And so if you go into some of it, you dig in there, the imagery is just powerful of sort of the wall itself. Right now they've got some stuff coming up on the ongoing genocide, and so things pop up and you can see new images of that. But some of their past exhibits and their projects include these images of sort of sections where Palestinians are trying to tear down the wall, or people on the Israeli side of the wall trying to also protest and take it down. Either because they don't believe in the wall. There are Israelis who believe that this is that the wall itself should not exist, that it is unjust. There are also Israelis who are Zionists who believe the wall prevents them from participating in settlements on the scale that they wish that they could do. And so the wall itself becomes a place of contention, both for Palestinians on one side, and then for Israelis who are anti-Zionist and Israelis who are Zionist, who don't like the wall and wish it would come down for various purposes. So if we go back to the slides, Courtney, you are getting to be an expert in reading, following the way my mind works. these things. So thank you. Where did I find in my notes? Okay, so it's a side of resistance, but then there's this other question of does it serve the purpose that Israel wanted it to? So the wall went up during the Second Intifada, and Israel continues to talk about it as a force for security, that it protects Israelis from particularly suicide attacks. Because in 2000 to 2008, or I think it was 8, yes, there was an uptick in suicide bombings and sort of suicide incidents, suicide bombings, where people came in and sort of either in buildings or with trucks and things like that, where Palestinians participated in suicide bombings of various kinds. In 2000, there were 4. In 2001, there were 35. In 2002, there were 53. And then again, there would be a downtick. In 2003, only 26. 2004, 12. In 2005, 8. Until by 2009, there were 0. What Israelis would point to, or what the Israeli forces point to, is the idea that as the wall went up, the suicide bombings went down, right? And that makes an easy correlation, but that does not equal causation, as we all know, right? We must be careful when we think about these things. The first segment of the wall only went up in 2002. But by 2002, like within the next year, the suicide bombings dropped by half and continued to drop by half, which means that there was already, this one segment of the wall did not prevent full infiltration. What they don't mention is that a number of those suicide attacks actually took place within Israel itself, far on sometimes the other coast. So other cities were, for example, sites where of these bombings on the other coasts, such as, find in my notes, I have a whole list of them, and it seems I've lost them. Haifa, I believe, was one site. No, where? I'm going to misspeak. I talk. Looks like it didn't get saved. That's all right. Oh, no, it did. I'm just skipping over it. Tel Aviv, Netanya, Jerusalem, Afula, Hadera. These are all places that are farther in, not close to the wall, but are actually farther in. Tel Aviv is on the other side, is on the coast. People did not travel through Jerusalem or across the West Bank. That was not what stopped those from happening, right? So there's definitely questionable information about the level of security. There is a sense of perceived security that maintains the wall as a certain amount of popularity. And when I was in Israel 2 summers ago, that was something that kept coming up over and over again in discussions with various Israeli Knesset members and people in the workshop that I was in, was that it really is not, in their minds, it is perceived security rather than actual sort of meaningful security. And then, so those are sort of key issues that I kind of wanted to raise, but I wanted to also raise it as sort of just as a reminder of kind of the extent to which this prevents movement, and sort of going back to these obstacles. So just some shocking facts that came across this OCHA report that came out in August 2023, that access to 20% of the West Bank is now prohibited by military order on the grounds that the area is designated as a firing zone for military training or as a border or buffer zone. So 20% of the West Bank itself as part of the wall, not just the wall, but sort of the extended security operations that the wall kind of represents. Palestinian access to about 10% of the West Bank lies within the municipal boundaries of Israeli settlements, and is many farmers can only reach their private land within or around settlements twice a year at most, subject to approval from Israeli authorities. And this is reinforced by that wall. Palestinians holding West Bank IDs require permits from the Israeli authorities to enter into East Jerusalem through 3 designated checkpoints, which creates huge traffic congestion. And in addition to all of this, there is extensive sets of obstacles put into place to sort of as an extension of the security that is supplied by the wall. So not themselves part of the wall, but which provide an extension of the restriction of movement that takes place as part of the security establishment that the wall provides basis for. So that is sort of my overview of the wall itself. And I'm happy to go back to some of these images or to talk about some of these images, or if people are scrolling and want to ask about it, I'm happy to take any questions. So any questions here or otherwise? Meg?
That who funded the wall?
So I guess what you're asking is who funded like the amount of regular contribution from the United States government. Yes. So the US government, and this goes back for many years, and I think we talked about this as maybe we didn't yet. But the US government essentially has been regularly funding Israeli militarization and security efforts since the 50s and 60s. And this really ticked up in after 67, and then it was really exploded financially in terms of regular payments to Israel after the Camp David Accords in the 70s, right? So in 73, there was war between Israel and Egypt, and the United States basically says, you all have to figure something out, and we will pay both sides of you to a significant sum of money to stop the war, right? And so Israel begins receiving billions of dollars. So we know that we annually send at least $4 billion as like our regular payments, tax dollars to Israel, a sort of rent that sort of underpins their security. And then every few years, on a regular basis, American funding is additional aid packages get sent. And these fluctuate. Most recently, if anybody's been paying attention to the Senate bill that came out, they've been talking about $14 billion. That's in addition to the billions of dollars that we're not really getting clear and distinct information about the aid packages and the military packages that are going out, because some of them are being funded by Congress, some of them are being done by executive order, some are probably part of the slush fund of the Pentagon's sort of larger defense budget. And then all of this becomes more complicated because then there are military exchanges and policing exchanges in techniques and trainings. So the exact cost of these kinds of security operations is really difficult to quantify, but a huge proportion of it comes from United States funding and deals. Yes. Other questions?
Do you mind going back to the map? Just any map here. Except that one.
Not that, but maybe this map.
What stuck out to me when looking at these boundaries is the fact that they never cross into Israel proper.
Yeah.
Like there's always, oh, we have to go around barriers. Like that's fair. I get it. Like if you're making a wall, I get that. But I do not see a single spot on this map where it goes the opposite way and the Palestinians get more territory than was allotted.
Yeah. No, so for those who are listening in, one of our audience members points out that for them it's a significant thing to note that the barrier always crosses this way eastward into the West Bank and not west into what Israel's international boundaries are. Right? And so it's always the cost is always at the expense of territory, land in the West Bank, not the other side. I will add further that there are entire sections which, is part of the security effort, the expansion. If you look at this area, all of this light bluish green in that map is under Israeli military control. And lots of these areas here, this is all like nature preserve and security boundary. So even access to the water, to the river, et cetera, there is sort of part of this larger security apparatus. So when we're talking about 10% within these boundaries and is unusable pieces that keep getting absorbed, that's all part of that. Other questions, comments?
Yeah, my second question was, what is this like little peninsula almost where right above where it says Israel? Do you know what that is specifically? That seems like the most one of more.
I looked it up and then I had to, and then I promptly forgot.
Fair enough.
But and I can't remember. I can't remember. And what if you know what? You go to maybe a different one of my other maps. Nope, it didn't tell me. Nope, I don't know. I looked it up and promptly forgot it, so I apologize. But I remember there being a city there, and I just can't for the life of me recall what that particular area is. Other questions? Anybody from the interwebs? I did note one of the things that interested me was that even Al Jazeera, which is sort of purported to be like this wildly, you know, I don't think it is. It's actually incredibly, you know, it's the best source of news that I've been able to find on a regular basis of covering what's been going on. But even Al Jazeera uses the terminology, the separation wall, in its official publications as a way of sort of being a little more neutral. It doesn't it emphasizes the idea that it's a wall and not just a fence, but it's still using some of that more neutral terminology. It hasn't lost its sense of quote objectivity.